Um, so we have a gun violence epidemic in this country. On an average day in this country, over 100 people are killed by firearms. Yet, despite tragedy after tragedy, nothing has gotten better. Not because we in the House have not acted, but because our colleagues in the Senate have failed to take up the many meaningful bills that we've sent to them. Today, we are meeting to finally change that by considering S. 2938, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. This is a compromise. It is certainly not everything I want, and it's not everything Republicans want. But it's the first opportunity we've had in decades to do something worthwhile to prevent gun violence. The U.S. Senate, can't get enough votes to agree on where to go for coffee, yet they came together with this bipartisan deal on a very contentious issue. I'm so disappointed that some of the leadership, Republican leadership in the House, seems to be not on board, and I think they're on the wrong side of history. I think they're doing what's easy rather than what's right, and I find that unfortunate and sad. But I'm asking, and will continue to ask, all my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, to do something that I know is the right thing to do. So join us supporting this reasonable bipartisan bill. And with that, I turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We're here on very short notice to consider S. 2938, which passed the Senate earlier today. Unfortunately, this measure constitutes yet another attempt by the majority to chip away at Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. It's unfortunate that this is the case because there are certainly items included in this bill that we could all support. My constituents certainly support additional money for school security, and my constituents also support providing additional funds for mental health. But this bill goes much further than that, and ultimately, what most House Republicans cannot and will not do is support additional restrictions on the Second Amendment, which is what the package before us will actually accomplish. Again and again, this Congress, we've watched the majority try to reduce or eliminate the rights of American citizens to purchase or own firearms. Today's bill is no exception. Whether it's dressed up as a partisan bill pushed solely by Democrats or ostensibly bipartisan bill written behind closed doors in the Senate, the end result is the same: an unwanted, unnecessary, unconstitutional, and deeply misguided intrusion into the rights of gun owners. While Republicans are committed to identifying and solving the root causes of violent crimes, we must ensure that in doing so, we protect the rights of the 99.9% of gun owners who are law-abiding citizens. But in their zeal to push anything on guns, the majority is instead taking us all on this first step down a slippery slope that will ultimately trample on the right to bear arms that's enshrined in the Constitution. And I believe the House should reject this bill. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to state for the record and remind everybody that this is not the majority's bill. We passed a bill, a few weeks ago, expressing where we thought we should go. This is the bill that Mitch McConnell and Senator Cornyn and Lindsey Graham, among others, support in a bipartisan way in the Senate. So, I just want to correct the record. I'm supporting this bill because even though I don't think it's nearly enough, but this is the best we can do, and it's a bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate. I'm happy now to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on Senate amendments to S. 2938, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Chairman Nadler, Representative Massey, we're delighted that you are here. Thank you for being here this early in the morning. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Chairman Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about S. 2938, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. With this legislation, we can take a historic first step toward ending America's epidemic of gun violence. We come to this moment after the tragic loss of so many innocent lives. 10 African Americans in Buffalo targeted because of their race, 19 young students and 2 teachers in Uvalde just a few days short of their summer vacations, scores more lost in other mass shootings too numerous to mention, and over 100 more Americans killed every day in gun violence that never makes the headlines. No piece of legislation can ever bring these lives back. No legislation can make their families or their communities whole. But we can act to keep others from facing the same trauma that they have induced. A few weeks ago, I was proud to come before you with the Protecting Our Kids Act, which took a bipartisan and comprehensive approach to ending gun violence. Pleased that the Senate incorporated portions of that bill into their own legislation. I wish there was more. I wish we could say we were doing everything we could to prevent another parent from losing their child to gun violence. And just to use figures as an illustration, if the bill we passed in the House would save 100,000 lives a year, and this bill would say, not a year, but 100,000 lives, and this bill would save 10,000, I mourn the fact that we can't pass a bill that will save 100,000, but I'll take the 10,000. I'm proud we're making an important start today. This cannot be the last step, but we also cannot let another day go by without taking action to make our communities safer and to keep even one more family whole. Recently, I've turned to particular teaching in the Talmud. Whoever takes one life, it's as if he kills the entire world. And whoever saves one life, it's as if he saves the entire world. This legislation includes provisions that will save many lives. Like the Protecting Our Kids Act, it includes funding to implement extreme risk protection laws and a prohibition on straw purchasing. It also strengthens background checks for those under 21, makes more sellers responsible for conducting background checks, takes steps to address the boyfriend loophole, and provides significant funding for programs that will make our communities safer. Today, we have the opportunity to send legislation to the President's desk for the first time in decades that will make progress toward ending the scourge of gun violence. I hope you will seize that opportunity and pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Massey, we're delighted you're here. You may offer your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to come here and testify on this bill. You know, as a member from the Eastern Time Zone, my district's in the Eastern Time Zone, I always wondered if we had an advantage over other members, but I'm glad to see that the Rules Committee removes all such advantages over living in any particular time zone because you meet at any time. Mr. Chairman, we all mourned the lives lost in the horrific tragedies in Buffalo and Uvalde. We should be working together to keep our schools and our communities safe. However, we can't keep people safe by limiting law-abiding citizens' rights to self-defense and assaulting Americans' constitutional rights. A couple weeks ago, the House considered H.R. 2377, the Federal Extreme Risk Protection Order. At that time, many Republicans pointed out that the bill violated constitutional due process rights set out in the 5th and 14th Amendments by depriving individuals of their property rights without having been charged, arraigned, or convicted of a crime. The bill before us today is even more troubling. I would argue that it is a case of legislative laziness. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is rushed over to this chamber after being rushed through the Senate, is a recipe for disaster. And I would note that we haven't had 3 days that we're supposed to have having a bill to review. And if this bill is that important, if it's the biggest gun bill in 30 years, gun control bill, as some have said, I think it deserves a little more time and consideration than it's being given today. It also comes the day after the Supreme Court has reaffirmed Americans' fundamental Second Amendment rights. The court's opinion could very well mean that this legislation is unconstitutional too, or some of the bills and laws that this legislation encourages the states to adopt could be unconstitutional. We should, at a minimum, take time to understand and have hearings about whether this bill comports with the Second Amendment in light of the court's recent decision. Instead, we are here rushing this bill through without even knowing whether it's constitutional. This bill pays the states hundreds of millions of dollars to implement so-called crisis intervention programs. These crisis intervention programs are just extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws, rebranded with a new name. I guess the authors of this legislation realize that red flag laws are unpopular, and that's why we're changing the name of them here second time in this bill. But unlike the red flag laws we've considered a couple weeks ago, there is zero direction to the states on how to set these up. While the criteria were bad enough in the red flag provisions we considered recently, This bill lets states set up their own programs using their own criteria, with the only advice from the authors that the provisions be constitutional. Now, I'm all for states' rights, but what we're doing here is we're robbing the money from the people and then going back and bribing the states to do something that's probably unconstitutional without giving them the guidelines. Because if we did give them guidelines, they probably would be unconstitutional guidelines, because red flag laws turn due process on its end. That's probably the American people shouldn't be subject to kangaroo court proceedings because a handful of senators used an artificial deadline in rushing to pass a law for political reasons, when they couldn't agree on important issues like the right to be heard when facing a deprivation of rights. These senators threw some words on paper, hoping nobody would notice what a terrible and ambiguous scheme they were creating. And if this scheme becomes law, it flips the burden of proof to individuals. The burden would be on the individual to challenge such a system to protect their rights. This will undoubtedly be a costly and time-consuming endeavor. Let's also not forget the states have mental health laws that require commitment of individuals who pose a risk to themselves or others. For example, New York authorizes commitment for individuals who pose a substantial threat of harm to self or others. New York also has one of the most extensive red flag laws on the books in this country. Yet a year after this killing spree, the Buffalo shooter indicated, a year before his killing spree, the Buffalo shooter indicated that he wanted to commit murder-suicide at his high school, and even after psychological evaluation and referral to police, authorities took no further action. If these red flag laws worked, we would see evidence in states that already have them, but the reality is they just don't work. Paying states hundreds of millions of dollars to implement more of these types of laws will not make us any safer. In fact, a study conducted by the Crime Prevention Research Center in 2018 found that, quote, red flag laws had no significant effect on murder, suicide, the number of people killed in mass public shootings, robbery, aggravated assault, or burglary, unquote. Furthermore, data shows that many extreme risk protection orders have been overturned when the respondent finally has an opportunity to be heard. This is far from the only problem with this legislation. Perhaps most problematically, the bill contains a backdoor universal background check. Under the current law, to be considered engaged in the business of dealing firearms, an individual must have the principal objective of livelihood and profit. The bill changes that to, quote, predominantly earn a profit. Who doesn't want to sell something for more than they paid for it? Is now anybody who sells a gun and sells it for more than what they paid for it engaged in the business of gun dealing without a license if they don't have a license? By lowering the threshold, this change will have the effect of criminalizing routine gun transactions between law-abiding Americans. The enhanced background checks on 18 to 20-year-olds will amount to an imposed waiting period for Americans between those ages to exercise their Second Amendment rights. I'm also concerned that it could have a racial disparity, the effect of this legislation by reaching back into the history of people when they were children. And one concern that I genuinely have about this bill is if a parent knows that seeking mental health will create a situation for their child when they grow up that they may have a stigma that they can't exercise a basic fundamental right, will that parent neglect or avoid seeking help for that child when, in fact, the brain is still forming and there could be an intervention that could stop this child from going off track? I'm worried that that stigma that this bill would cause and the deprivation of rights as an adult for seeking help as a child will cause parents not to seek that help. And we could see more dangerous situations because of that. I urge an open rule on this extremely flawed bill. We really do need to have some amendments and some more debate on it. And I thank the chairman and the ranking member, and I yield back.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to say anything. I'll yield to Mr. Cole.
Just a couple of quick questions to my friend to Kentucky. Mr. Massey, what provisions in this legislation, in your view, restrict Second Amendment rights?
Well, the Democrats often say they don't want to take your guns away. But what is a red flag law? It's taking your guns away. It's not taking some of your guns away. It's taking all of your guns away. And I think the most troubling provision in here is the red flag provision where we are bribing the states to adopt it. Many states already have some form of red flag law that's not working, and all 50 states in the union have laws known as Baker Act or 5150 in California that allow individuals to be involuntarily committed and to have their firearms taken away. But the difference with those existing laws and what this bill promotes is that there's due process, that there's a mental health expert involved, that you are appointed a lawyer if you can't afford one, and you get the right to meet your accuser. Just basic fundamental due process rights.
Okay, and many people have stated, and you alluded to this, that this is, quote, the most significant piece of legislation impacting gun laws in 3 decades. But your committee had no hearings on this legislation. Is that correct?
That is correct. This, you know, I was before this committee a week or two ago, and we have marked up multiple bills in our Judiciary Committee, gun bills. This has very little resemblance to any of those. And I think really the Committee of Jurisdiction here in Congress should be looking at legislation like this. You know, why can't we do the Senate bill and a House bill and then bring them to conference and resolve the differences? Why are we going to defer to a bunch of sleep-deprived senators who've rushed this thing over to us and just rubber stamp it? It should go through committee.
And your committee didn't hold a markup on this legislation, did it?
We had no hearing and no markup on this legislation.
What about on the other side? Just out of curiosity, I know you follow this issue. Did they have a committee process?
They had a process. Some of them met behind closed doors, and then they wheeled this thing out and rushed it onto the floor. If you call that a process, it's not a good process.
I don't think they had, they did not have a hearing. They did not have a markup. You describe it exactly right. We had a self-appointed group get together, put something together, talking only to themselves, and then basically rush it through. And that's essentially what's happening here. You know, we are basically abdicating our institutional power and responsibility by not going through our own process with this legislation. It ought to go before your committee. It ought to have a hearing, it ought to have a markup, and then we ought to act. We shouldn't be sitting here just simply accepting whatever a group of senators decided they wanted to do. That's not the way this system was envisioned to work. So anyway, I thank you for coming here on such short notice, because you didn't have much notice at all, and so early in the morning, because again, we're intent on subverting our own process to get something through, to meet the deadline of a lot of senators who want to get home. That's really the only reason here we're moving with this kind of speed and without any deliberation or appropriate process, in my view. So again, I thank my friend for coming here on such short notice. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mrs. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling us even at 7 a.m. On a Friday to take up this legislation. You know, I guess I would agree with the ranking member on one thing, and that is that this certainly isn't the most significant legislation in 3 decades. The most significant piece of legislation in 3 decades was legislation that was passed in 2005. It was the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, PLCAA. That law shields bad actors within the gun industry from being held accountable for dangerous products or irresponsible business practices that harm people and endanger public safety. From the day that that law passed, we have seen a significant increase in gun violence. Communities across the nation have experienced gun violence that have been raising their voices for years, pleading with Congress to do something. And I really resent when people refer to Congress not doing anything, because the Democrats in the House has repeatedly passed common sense gun violence legislation in an effort to keep our community safe and to answer the calls demanding some reform. But after years of heartbreak and deadly mass shootings after mass shooting after mass shooting, we are finally here this morning to take up this miserable legislation sent over to us from the Senate last night. And while I know that some are celebrating progress today, I am certainly not. Doesn't go far enough. This bill before us today is the bare minimum, and we should be embarrassed. The bare minimum to protect children that are being murdered while learning their ABCs, to protect people that are going innocently, going to a concert, murdered because they love country music. People murdered simply because they're African American or they're Latin American. And they're shopping at a mall, at Walmart. You know, there has been 279 mass shootings in 2022 alone, this year. And according to the CDC, we lost 45,000 lives each year due to gun violence. Just last week, I was at a memorial for the 2015 San Bernardino shooting. I spoke to families who are still affected to this day by the loss of their loved ones. We owe it to them to do far more than this legislation. We must do more to help our children. So while I will support this miserable legislation today, I don't want anyone, either here in the Rules Committee or in our communities, to pretend that we have done enough to help our children survive in their classrooms. And putting up steel bars around a campus isn't public safety. Imprisoning our kids while they learn their ABCs isn't public safety. Taking guns away from dangerous individuals is public safety. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do associate myself with the remarks of the ranking member, and I do think this is an extremely significant bill that we are considering adopting a rule to then consider on the floor. I agree with Representative Massey that the word rushed really underdescribes what the process we have in front of us today is. And I guess, Mr. Massey, I would just ask, do you have an opinion as to why, if this is indeed the most significant legislation that's going to pass this Congress this year, what would be the hazard in letting people actually look at it and give us feedback?
Well, I won't impugn the motives of anybody in this chamber, but I'm not afraid to do that of the senators. I think, okay. Well, I'm told that under the rules I can't, but there is a vacation coming up, and it might have been considered. I'm trying to be very polite. The last time I was in this hearing, I thought I'd never be back for 3 years, and so maybe I could have been more cordial, but here I am again, understanding I might be here again in a week, so I'll try to keep it cordial, but I won't question their motives then. I will just say that if the American people would have a chance to see if this bill is actually going to work, and if they studied the details of it, I think they would agree with one of the members on this committee from the other side of the aisle who just said it's miserable legislation. That, and those were her words, not mine, and they will find that it's not really going to solve the problem. And I think that's why there's a rush to get this done, because there's a pressure to get something done. And this something is not the right answer.
But do you have an opinion as to, as people look at this and evaluate it for themselves, are they likely to be supportive or less than supportive? I mean, you and I come from states where our senators are split on their opinions on this, so clearly there can be more than one opinion back home. I know the preponderance of opinions that I'm seeing from my senator's support of one of my senators' support of this. Do you encounter the same thing in your state?
I can't speak for the other 434 congressional districts, but I can tell you in my congressional district, there is very little support for this. And as they dig into the details, I think what support there is going to be withering. And again, I think it's rushed. And if people have an opinion of this bill, that it's not really going to be well informed, because there hasn't been a chance to vet it.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that's the tragedy of this situation. Let me just ask you this: I've been concerned for some time about the lack of prosecutions by the Department of Justice when people knowingly, or they know that someone has lied on their background check form. Is there anything in this legislation that you've been able to discern that will solve that problem or help that problem?
No, and that's a big problem. In the last year that we have data for denials in the NICS background check system, there were 112,000 denials. Now, what they were denied for ostensibly was for being an ineligible purchaser trying to purchase a firearm, which in itself is a crime. And in order to commit that crime, ostensible crime, they had to lie on a form, which in itself is punishable by 5 years. So how many of those 112,000 denials were punished in the last year that we have data? 12. 12 were punished out of 112,000. Were prosecuted at the federal level, I should say. Why aren't we prosecuting people for committing crimes that they're already committing right now? That's a troubling question. Frankly, there's two answers to that. The first answer is, of those 112,000 denials, most of them are law-abiding citizens who were deprived of their right to keep and bear arms, to purchase a firearm. But there probably were a lot of ineligible people in there who tried to purchase a firearm, and why are we not prosecuting people for the gun laws that they're already breaking? I'm at a loss to explain why we wouldn't do that.
Yeah, me too, and it is, I mean, it underscores your earlier statement about how this is a restriction on the law-abiding part of our population and really provides no additional protection for them. And the shame of it is, earlier this week, in this committee, we heard two bills from the Energy and Commerce Committee that went through regular order, legislative hearings, subcommittee markup, full committee markup, and both of our witnesses, Democrat and Republican, agreed that the bills were better for having gone through that process. We actually are capable of doing good work. And this time, for whatever reason, the majority parties decided to short-circuit that and bring this to the floor in haste. And you know what they say, you work in haste, you can repent in leisure. Thank you, Mr. Massey, for being here.
Thank you. Mr. Promoter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I just want to applaud the Senate, unlike my friend, Mr. Cole, who has from time to time reminded us about getting senators from both parties to support pieces of legislation. Here, 15 Republicans and all the Democrats support this piece of legislation. Would I have written it the way they wrote it? No. But it certainly is an advance from where we are today. And I just want to thank them for taking the time to come up with this piece of legislation. Mr. Massey has been before us on this subject before. We've had a conversation about the preamble to the Constitution and the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment and the 4th Amendment and all sorts of things. Obviously, I believe every provision here is constitutional. It'll ultimately be tested by the Supreme Court, which I think is very off base in terms of its view of the Second Amendment, and over time that their decisions will change. I think yesterday's decision on concealed weapons laws out of New York being ruled unconstitutional, completely off base, completely wrong, looking at their arguments, you know, the only word I can come up with is sophistry, which means a lot of baloney in an opinion. But that's my perspective. We're here today on this legislation, and again, not what I would have written, but I do think this is substantial advancement for the protection of everyday Americans within the bounds of the Constitution, and I'm going to support this 100%.
Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I associate my remarks with the ranking member. Mr. Massey, I've got a lot of problems with this bill, as I know you do too. Let's just focus on the curtailing of rights for individuals 18 to 21. Could you go into more detail of how this will actually impact those individuals' Second Amendment rights?
Well, it's going to, I think it's constitutionally problematic to treat people 18 to 21 differently for a fundamental right like the Second Amendment, to treat them differently than you would treat anybody else. There's no provision in the Constitution that allows that. It's going to be effectively a delay on their purchase that's different than others. And I wish this included a study on the impact of this by race and income level, because I'm worried that when you apply extra scrutiny to 18 to 21-year-olds, you're also going to get more false denials. And we've seen that with the NICS background check, that's already happening. And there's a disparate effect by race. And I think there are even some progressives in this body who are worried about that provision and the heightened scrutiny on 18 to 21-year-olds.
Yeah, I think there's already precedent out there from the Ninth Circuit, which is clearly not a circuit known for conservative opinions. Jones v. Bonta saying that it's actually unconstitutional to do this. Do you want to expand upon that?
No, I would just echo that. That is a recent decision, and I'm glad they came to that. Some people are saying it's because they luck of the draw. There was a random panel of judges, and they got lucky, and they upheld the Constitution that day. But as we've seen from the Supreme Court's recent ruling yesterday, I think when that decision that you just mentioned, that you can't deprive rights, this basic fundamental right that's enshrined in the Constitution, I think in light of yesterday's ruling at the Supreme Court and in light of the ruling in the Ninth Circuit that you mentioned, that what we have here in front of us today is an unconstitutional bill, at least that provision of it, that applies to 18 to 20-year-olds.
Thanks, Mr. Massey. And I want to focus on the engaged in business language, which, as you alluded to in your opening statement, is really a backdoor for universal background checks. Would you like to just talk about the practical implications of the engaged in business language?
You know, this is something that's always troubled me, the gray area and whether you need to have a federal firearms license or not. And I think there's something bipartisan we could do on this. Why do we want so much gray area here? And I worry, and I know people personally, before I came to Congress, who were prosecuted for selling firearms without a license and served time in prison, but they were selling from a personal collection. And that's, you know, and it's always debatable what's a personal collection, what's not. There's no numeric number on it. It's not, we don't define whether you need an FFL or not here in any way that's objective. It's all subjective, and they've made it even more subjective here, and I'm worried that by making the line less bright, by graying the line between who's selling from a personal collection and who's in the business of doing this as a vocation, we're going to end up with more people prosecuted who are just merely trying to transfer a firearm from a legal law-abiding citizen to another legal law-abiding citizen.
And you would agree that the push to do this would ultimately lead to a national gun registry, because even Eric Holder said you can't have universal background checks without a national registry. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that is what this is. This is a backdoor universal background check, which is basically a registry. As we've seen at the ATF, they've collected hundreds of millions of gun records, and put them in a searchable database, which is something they are specifically precluded from doing by federal law, yet we see that they're keeping this database. And what this provision will do is people will never know after this provision passes whether they can be prosecuted for transferring a firearm if they don't go to a dealer to do it. And so every time you go to a dealer, you create this paper trail, which, by the way, if it were useful, you know, in solving crime, there might be a reason to have it, but it's been proven, again, not to be useful. And this is going to cause, this is, I think, the precursor to creating a universal background check system for the purposes of a registry.
Thanks, Mr. Massey. My last line of question regards ex parte hearings. I'm one of the few people in Congress, I actually might be the only one in this chamber that's actually presided over an ex parte hearing when I was a magisterial district judge. I can tell you it is difficult when you're only hearing one side of the story. More often than not, I'd be willing to guess it was over 95% of the time the petitioner wins because it's his or her case that you're hearing no facts from the other side. I'm incredibly worried about this with the red flag hearings. Would you like to talk about how this could curtail somebody's due process rights?
Absolutely, and I'd like to add to what you're saying, something based on discussion I had with a senator last night. Again, we're trying to collect information about this bill. It's being rushed through, so I thought I'd talk to a senator. And this senator pointed out that if a judge, you know, goes through this red flag hearing and deems somebody unfit, you know, in a snap judgment, it may be another judge who has to review that. And there's going to be an inherent bias in that second judge now, not to overturn the first judge, because the implications of making a mistake are so great that that judge, his career would be ended. And so the inclination of the second judge, who's going to be reviewing the snap judgment of the first one, is to, you know, uphold it. And so there's a low level of proof that's required in that snap judgment because it's supposed to be for only a few days. But that hearing biases the second judge. And I think that's going to create a big problem. And we've seen that in states. Like there's thousands of people who are on these lists now who can't buy a gun, who are obviously not a danger to themselves or others.
Thanks, Mr. Massey. We could talk about the states that actually do have red flag laws, in fact, that there's no differential in crime. In fact, there's some evidence that in those places, for example, New York, you actually have higher levels of crime. But we'll leave that to another day for the sake of time. So thank you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. This bipartisan legislation is a small step in lifting the stranglehold of the NRA over the American legislative process with its warped and deformed interpretation of the Second Amendment, which is at odds with what the Supreme Court has said. There are hundreds of millions of dollars here for state crisis intervention orders, hundreds of millions of dollars for mental health services in schools. So this is legislation that I can support and I can get behind. It doesn't nearly address the problem in the comprehensive way that we need to address the problem the way that the vast majority of the American people are expecting us to do. Mr. Massey, it's good to see you. I just wanted to clarify something. Do you support or you oppose background checks?
The current system is so flawed, I'd have to oppose it.
Okay. So when you say we should enforce the laws that are there, mm-hmm. I took that to mean that you think that we should be enforcing the background check laws against people who are trying to abuse it.
Anybody who breaks the law should be punished, yes, and I'm worried that they're not now.
Okay. But is it your reading of the Second Amendment that background check laws are unconstitutional?
My reading or the Supreme Court's reading, Heller,
well,
yeah. Let's just go by, rather than say what I would want for it to say, let's go by Supreme Court decision, and I think they have they've said, even just recently, as yesterday, even though I haven't made it all the way through this, that those sorts of things are allowable.
Yeah, okay, so we can uphold them. So, I mean, I hope you're saying, but you may not be, but I hope you're saying that you would support an efficient and accurate universal background check law.
Well, in fact, as you probably remember, a week or two ago, the majority moved a gun control bill through our committee, and I offered an amendment, which you all graciously accepted, and we passed on the floor, that would try to find out, would try to improve that system and look at what's happening with all of those denials and why they're being denied.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll just say I think it's been decades since the Senate has been able to move anything. So this is a ray of light coming through. But when you look at the death toll in our big cities and small towns across the country, the urban areas and the rural areas and suburban areas, we're in a bloodbath of gun violence across the country. And what we saw in Buffalo, the convergence of gun violence with deranged, racist delusions, that is a huge threat to the people of the country. What we saw happen in Texas and Uvalde is a nightmare that is a call upon the moral conscience of everybody in the country to act. I just reject the idea that we can accept the sacrifice of children to a completely distorted and deformed concept of what the Second Amendment says. So this legislation begins to move us in the right direction. There's some positive parts about it, and I'm going to be supporting it. I'll go back.
Thank you. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to associate myself with the remarks of the ranking member and the other Republican members. I guess I'm just so disappointed that we're here at 7 a.m. in the morning. We are doing a great disservice to the American people by rushing this through. And the chairman even mentioned that that this isn't the majority's bill, and I've heard concerns about the bill. It is the majority's process, though, and we could be holding hearings, and we could be looking at these things, that both sides, these are important issues, and we could have those hearings if the majority allowed it. But instead, we're here at 7 a.m. while people are on this side of the country are getting their kids ready to take them to school. On the other end of the country, they're still in bed. And so we are pushing this through without any kind of proper procedure and allowing people to understand what's in this bill. And so that's just horribly disappointing to me, because I think there are important issues on both sides that are being brought up. And so I will just, I just wanted to make sure that I made those comments, because as a freshman, I think, you know, you expect more. You expect more, you expect to be able to understand what's in a bill, before you have to vote on it, have public input, have the public understand what's in it so they can call your office. And so with that, I would just like to ask Mr. Massey if there's anything you would like to add before we finish.
No, I would just say, I got notice that I was going to be here late last night, around 10 or midnight. I was trying to talk to senators yesterday to find out if what we were going to be doing here, because we couldn't find out from our own majority leadership when this was going to pass and what was going to happen today. But I do regret that we're not following a procedure here or a process that the majority even voted for in their rules package at the beginning of this Congress, which was to give us 3 legislative days. And I'm actually particularly 72 hours. I will be rough on our own party. You know, when we were in the majority, we had a 3-day rule, and which kind of got abused a little bit. Sometimes we'd introduce a bill at 11 p.m., and then you'd have 1 day, and then the next morning, so it would touch 3 days. And I think the Democrats made a wise choice and made it a 72-hour rule instead of a 3-day rule, so that there was no fudging it. But I'm at a loss to explain why we were here just a few hours later after this bill passes the Senate. It seems like we're not following that 72-hour rule that the Democrats put in place.
Well, and I appreciate that. It's just very disappointing, and I think a disservice to the American public that we are pushing this through like we are. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, let me before I yield to Ms. Scanlon, let me just say I'm sorry people are inconvenienced for being here early in the morning, but I think it's important. And when I hear talk about process, I should point out that the text of this bill, by the way, was available on Tuesday night. So we technically did not follow the rule that you mentioned, but the idea that people are just seeing this for the first time this morning, it's kind of hard to believe. But I'd say one other thing about process. Nobody complained about a process over in the other body that prohibited and obstructed any debate on any of the many measures that we have passed over the years to deal with gun violence. Measures that have gone through hearings, measures that have gone through markups, but because of the process over there, where there's a dictatorship of the minority, they can prevent a debate, even a discussion on this. Nobody complained about that. And I have to be honest with you, it's a little frustrating to hear some of the discussion here, where there seems to be more passion about making sure an 18-year-old can buy an AR-15 than there is about protecting little kids in this country. And I got to tell you, you know what? Yeah, I mean, there should be a sense of urgency to bring this to the floor, and I'm glad we are. And again, this is, and the gentle lady is right. I mean, this is not the majority's bill. This is not the majority in the House's bill. You saw what we proposed a couple of weeks ago. But we're living in a time when you have to accomplish what you can accomplish given the reality in the other body. And the fact that senators who I don't agree with on almost anything, from the Senate Minority Leader, to Senator Cornyn from Texas, that the fact that they could come together and come up with something, I think is actually important. So, yeah, I will defend this process right now because I think we have used an abused process to make sure that we've avoided doing anything on this for years. And meanwhile, there have been massacre after massacre after massacre. And it's about time we put our kids first. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bipartisan Safer Communities bill, which the Senate has sent to us, is, to be charitable, a baby step towards addressing the epidemic of gun violence that's plaguing our country and killing our children. Having in the past 3.5 years participated in multiple hearings and markups of dozens of gun safety measures here in the House, I'm glad that after 30 years, the Senate has finally managed to do something to address gun violence. The provisions of the Senate bill about which I'm most excited are, strangely, those to which our Republican colleagues object the most. The provisions encouraging states to pass red flag or extreme risk protection act laws. To be clear, no red flag law has been signed into law in this country without substantial due process protections, which is a stark contrast to the 40,000 Americans who are killed by gun violence every year without due process protections. I also want to note that where red flag laws have been enacted, lives have been saved. And I would seek unanimous consent to introduce an article hot off the presses at 6:30 this morning, June 24th, from the Penn Capital Star. The headline is, "Red Flag Laws Saved 7.3 Americans in 2020 alone and could have saved 11.4 thousand more." I yield back.
Mr. Morelli.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen to my colleagues discuss the failure of the legislative process would be comical. Approximately 125 Americans hadn't died of gun violence in the past 24 hours. Today, while we debate, a very modest attempt to address an epidemic of gun violence in our nation, another 125 Americans will die. Over the weekend, While pundits discuss what we did or did not do in Washington this week, 250 more Americans will die at the hands of lethal weapons. This week, while we pore over a decision by our highest court that is ill-informed, misguided, and out of touch, 875 Americans will die violently. 1,250 citizens in this country will lose their lives in those 10 days. They will leave families behind that will grieve their loss, and they will deal with the senselessness of it all with the full knowledge that their so-called leaders care so little about their lives that they drone on about the need to protect law-abiding citizens, to possess lethal weapons, and impose virtually no requirement on those citizens to act responsibly or to have accountability for their actions. In the next month, while Americans celebrate the founding of this extraordinary nation, 3,750 of our fellow citizens will die. Those citizens will be black, white, and brown. They will be children, teens, middle-aged, and elderly. They will be white collar and blue collar. They will live in big cities, suburban towns, and rural communities. They will leave behind families that will never, ever celebrate life's important milestones, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, job promotions, retirements. If we sit here this morning and talk, Americans are begging for action. 70% of them believe we have failed. They want gun laws that are sensible and reasonable. They want the carnage to stop, and they want Congress to care about them and their lives. They don't understand why we can't adapt to a world filled with AR-15s and AK-47s and ghost guns and high-capacity magazines, instead of the world that folks like Madison and Hamilton, John Jay wrote about in the 18th century, when the great threat wasn't the private right of arms, but the overreach of a central government. Does the federal government not have the wisdom or the will to protect its citizens and make certain we can require responsible gun ownership? This bill is limited. My colleagues have talked about it. As much as I appreciate the work of the Senate, it doesn't go nearly far enough. We've dealt with this over the weeks in the past. It offers, however, some hope that the massive violence and carnage can be stopped. So let's be worthy of our duties and our responsibilities. Please, please, please. Americans are looking to us. This is the time to act, and I will support the rule and the underlying bill. I appreciate all the work by my colleagues to get us even this far. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say I'm happy to be up at 4 in the morning here on the West Coast to vote on this bill that is a compromise. I think it was Bismarck who said politics is the art of compromise. With all due respect to my colleagues, my friends on the other side, if we can't compromise on this with the Senate, I wonder where we can compromise. So just also like to associate myself with your comments, Mr. Chairman. I wonder about the rights of those 10-year-olds. What about the rights of kids in Connecticut and Florida? What about their rights? Isn't that more important than rights of people who go out and buy a gun? In California, they can buy them now, and the law that the Supreme Court just changed, ironically, in many ways, will affect what we tried to do in California when I was in the legislature to accommodate rural areas. Might actually become more difficult. So anyways, with that, I just want to thank everyone involved with this compromise. It's clearly not what we on our side want, but it'll save people's lives. And for that reason alone, I would vote for it. And in particular, I want to acknowledge that we haven't talked about, as a member of the Education and Labor Committee with Mr. Morelli, there's a really good investment on school safety in getting behavioral health, mental health resources into schools that'll save kids' lives. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there are plenty of families out there and relatives of people who perished unnecessarily because of gun violence who think we haven't moved fast enough. And our personal inconvenience is nothing compared to their grief and staying up all night and those parents worried about their kids going to school. And this is a good first step. And it deals with two of the persistent problems that we have, which is having young people between the ages of 18 and 21 commit the vast majority of mass shootings in public spaces, and making sure they do not have access to firearms if they are a risk. And then my state of North Carolina is one of the top states for gun trafficking, and it addresses this issue. I am so proud of North Carolina's two Republican senators for voting for this bill, and Senator Tillis for being part of this bill. And he understands it. He was Speaker of our House of Representatives when the Republicans were in charge and we could not get some of these measures through. We're a purple state. We understand this issue. We respect the Second Amendment, but we want to keep people safe. And Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of Congressman Price's wife, Lisa, who fought for common sense gun safety for decades in North Carolina and passed yesterday, I am honored to support this rule and this bill.
Thank you, and our thoughts and prayers are with our colleague David Price. Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly concur with the sentiments expressed by my colleagues on the Democratic side. I won't belabor the point. I support the bill that we're considering today. I would just simply say there's one particular argument that's a pernicious one, in my view, that I've heard quite a bit of this morning, which is this notion about procedural concerns. Let's be serious. I mean, we can debate the contours of the Second Amendment and the Heller decision and our respective views of the rights conferred under the Second Amendment and the breadth and the depth of those rights. And I will give credit to Representative Massey, because I think he relishes that debate. I think his view is not reflective of probably the vast majority of Democrats or Republicans in the House. But that being said, he adheres to that viewpoint. But the notion that we would spend this entire hearing talking about process when we all know this is a bipartisan bill that has strong support in the Senate, I think it obfuscates from fundamentally the part of this conversation that I suppose my colleagues wish to avoid, which is that their position is more extreme than Mitch McConnell's and John Cornyn's and Todd Young. 15 Republican senators have decided that this bill will save lives. And for the American public, it's important for them to recognize as they're watching these proceedings that my colleagues on the House Republican side disagree with them. So I think it's fairly clear, and I wish my colleagues would defend their position on the merits as opposed to making these procedural arguments, which I think we should dispense with. So with that, I'll yield back to the chair. I plan to support the rule and the bill.
Thank you. I think everybody has asked questions, so I want to thank Mr. Massey and Mr. Nadler for being with us, and I'm sure we'll see you on the floor. Yeah.
I'd like to enter into the record first-year implementation of Colorado's Violence Prevention Act, which is our red flag law dated August 2021, and how it's worked in Colorado so far.
Without objection. Thank you very much.
Say one more thing.
What? You can say whatever you want.
Thank you. I see my colleague Bobby Scott is here to, I presume, to offer an amendment, and I would encourage the Rules Committee to allow his amendment. I haven't even read it. And the same for my colleague Marjorie Taylor Greene back here. I think we need a process, even if it's something I don't agree with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman Nadler. Thank you, Mr. Massey. And now our next panel is Representative Greene and Representative Scott. Representative Greene, you can proceed.
There we go. Good morning, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole. One thing I'm happy to see out of everyone on this committee is a passion for saving lives. I think that is incredibly important, and I want you to know I share that passion with you. The heartbreaking, I guess, responsibility that we all have is when a tragedy occurs, like the horrific shooting in Uvalde, the attack in Buffalo. against Black Americans, and attacks anywhere, it definitely makes us feel like we have to do something to stop these things. But I think the reality that we all have to recognize we have to live with is that there's nothing that any of us can do, there's no law that we can create that can change the heart and the mind of another human. See, people have been killing other people since the beginning of time, and this was long before guns were ever invented. And it will continue to go on in places where people don't have guns to defend themselves. Murder still exists. We already have laws against murder. We already have many gun control laws, but yet it continues. Now, I want to recognize the fact that I want to share something with you. In 1990, when I was in high school, and our schools became gun-free school zones, another student at my school brought guns to school, into our school, and our school went on lockdown. Now, the only person in our school that day was our very upset, and definitely he had mental problems, many issues going on. He'd been bullied, and he'd brought guns to school to kill other students. And that was one of the most terrifying days of my life. It was shocking to all of us. We'd never been through anything like that, never expected it. And it's a real fear. It is a terrible fear as a teenager, as a student, to know that the only person that is in control of everything going on is a very upset, mentally ill person with a gun. And that no one else in the school building has a gun to protect us or to protect anyone. And that was a lesson for me. It was a very real lesson for me that I never want to be in a situation where I am powerless to defend myself, my family, or anyone else. And it has been cemented in me. As a woman, I never want to be powerless. I never want to be without a gun, because the gun is the great equalizer. And as a mother of 3 children, I've dropped my children off at school year after year, every single school year, knowing that if that happened at my high school, when schools became gun-free school zones, that it could happen at one of their schools, because their schools were gun-free school zones. And that's a fear that no parent should feel. And then just recently, speaking with friends of mine in Georgia, Angela Stanton King, also Martin Luther King's niece, Alveda King, and others, and we were discussing the shooting in Buffalo. The most disturbing part about that horrible young man that went there and murdered those people that day is he wrote in his manifesto that he chose that area because of their strict gun control laws, and that he knew he could go and kill as many people as he could because they couldn't defend themselves. Those were his words in his manifesto. And my heart breaks for Black Americans, especially in Buffalo. They couldn't defend themselves. Now, all of us work, and we're here together in a body in a building that is protected by men with guns. And we enjoy that great privilege. How privileged we are to be protected in that manner. But the American taxpayers, the average American citizen, the people that voted for us, that sent us here to represent them, they don't have that privilege that we have. They don't have the privilege to be protected by armed guards with AR-15s and 9mm and semi-automatic weapons. They don't have that protection, but we do. We sure are special. We're very elite in that way. So I would like to ask the committee to make my amendment in order to ensure that every American is guaranteed their due process rights. And the reason why I make this simple is because while we are on different ends of the spectrum on what we believe and our passions about the Second Amendment and about guns, I would like to talk about one thing that we're all called to protect, and that's Americans' due process rights. My amendment would clarify that nothing in this bill can be interpreted to deny any person their constitutionally protected right to life, liberty, and property without due process. Now, here's the problems in this bill that just came out of the Senate. This legislation violates the clear language of the Second Amendment that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And the reason why that's important is this bill that we're debating here right now, and this bill that we're all very likely to be voting on later today, you see, it puts the gun on trial, but it's the people that commit the act with the gun. They're the ones that commit these acts. And we know that they can murder people other ways. Darrell Brooks proved that by driving a car through a Christmas parade, running people down. So we have to do everything we can to protect the due process rights and the rights of Americans to keep and bear arms, because it shall not be infringed. Just yesterday, the Supreme Court upheld the right of lawful gun owners to carry their weapons outside the home and reaffirmed the individual right to keep and bear arms. And it's an irony that that happened out of the Supreme Court at the same time when Republican and Democrat senators were coming together to actually violate Americans' Second Amendment rights. Instead of listening to the court's clear precedent in multiple cases, Congress is actually trying to disarm gun owners. There's precedents. D.C. versus Heller held that the Second Amendment applies to individuals. McDonald versus the City of Chicago held that the Second Amendment applies to state and local governments, not just the federal government. The bill shifts the burden of proof away from the government and onto law-abiding gun owners to show why they should be allowed to keep their firearms when maybe they have not even done anything wrong and they're being falsely accused. This bill encourages states to adopt extreme risk protection orders, which would confiscate the weapons of a person before they have ever committed a crime. It makes people guilty without ever doing anything wrong. Now, even though the bill lists several due process protections, such as an in-person hearing, an unbiased adjudicator, the right to know opposing evidence, the right to present evidence, and the right to confront adverse witnesses, here's the real issue. The bill is entirely unclear when the bill requires those rights to be protected. You see, that can all take place after someone's firearms have been confiscated. For example, under this bill, a person could be red flagged and have his gun seized by police without their presence. And then only after the guns were taken might they be given these supposed due process rights. So it's a direct violation, and this bill is too vague. Recent testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee by David Kopel showed that at least 1/3 of all red flag tips are false accusations. And I think that's a dangerous place for us to put Americans in. There is no amount of due process steps that can be added to risk protection orders to make them constitutional. They violate the Second, the Fourth, the Fifth, and 14th Amendments. The bill references persons, also, this is something important too, in a dating relationship that could be subject to a gun confiscation order or prosecution that does not clearly define what constitutes a dating relationship. The bill leaves the particulars for a judge to decide. The failure of prosecutors to prosecute domestic violence crimes is not a reason to start restricting the due process rights of Americans by disarming lawful gun owners. Now let's talk about our rights. Our Constitution is clear that no citizen can be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The Fifth Amendment explicitly applies this protection against the federal government. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now, also, the 14th Amendment applies to this protection against the states because it clearly says no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now, here's why my amendment is important. The legislation actually pays or bribes states to implement these laws that fundamentally violate the due process rights of their citizens. It's incentivizing states, it's funding states for red flag laws, and we shouldn't be doing that. All I'm asking is that Congress confirm that each person's due process rights must be protected as this legislation is implemented. The language is intentionally broad, and that's the problem. Broad language can be used the wrong ways. And it gives more protection to law-abiding gun owners and clearly shows Congress' intent that no one's rights should be violated. That's what my amendment will do. I see no reason why the committee would not welcome the opportunity to add more due process protections to this bill and reaffirm the rights of all Americans, as that is our duty. I ask that you make my amendment in order, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole, members of the committee. First, I'd just like to insert my full statement into the record. And, Mr. Chairman, it's a fairly straightforward amendment. Nothing in this act or amendment made by this act may be construed to expand circumstances in which the death penalty or mandatory minimum may be imposed. The purpose of this is to clarify whether or not this bill expands the death penalty. I've asked many people whether or not it expands the death penalty, and frankly haven't gotten a very good answer. And this would just clarify that it does not. It is my understanding that there was no intent to expand the death penalty, and this would make that clear. The issue comes when you add two offenses, Code 932 and 933, including straw purchases and trafficking, to the racketeering code. Racketeering code has the death penalty, and these two predicate offenses added to RICO means if you've committed those, you're subject to the RICO offenses, which include the death penalty. So it appears on its face that it is, but I can't get much clarity, but this amendment would clarify that and show that it does not trigger any additional death penalties. It is particularly relevant in states that don't have the death penalty, because if you can't go federal, there's no death penalty available. If you're in a no death penalty state, if you have a federal death penalty, you could have that death penalty imposed even though the state doesn't allow it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to, number one, thank both our witnesses for coming on such short notice. And I wish we'd been able to give you more time, and I wish we had the opportunity for the questions you posed to be answered. You know, that would shape the amendments that you're offering. You know, I've listened to what my colleagues had to say very carefully, and I respect them all very deeply, and I know they are very passionate and very sincere about this issue. But I would caution all of us not to dismiss out of bound or out of order the idea of process and how important that is. Process is what protects this institution. Process is what protects every individual member of this institution. Process is what protects the minority. And if things change next year, I suspect we'll hear lots of process arguments out of my friends on the other side. The reality is, you know, we are, in my view, and I've seen this happen a lot this Congress, we surrendered on process on the quote-unquote bipartisan transportation bill. You can like it or not like it, but nobody in this chamber had a damn thing to do with it. They didn't write it. They couldn't amend it. They couldn't add anything to it. We just accepted a $1 trillion-plus deal. This bill, my friends have all told me, is not enough. They don't like the bill. I respect that opinion. Then, for goodness sakes, let's have a process. Let's produce a bill you like, and let's go to conference. That's how this is supposed to work. You might actually get something in a conference that's better than what you've got in front of you from your point of view. I might actually get something I like less. I don't like this particularly at all. But the point is, we basically are surrendering, and we're surrendering in a sense to people that don't have a process on their side because they didn't go to committee. They didn't write this bill. They got a group of them together. They decided to negotiate by themselves. They presented it, they got it rammed through, and we're surrendering to that. We would actually be doing them a favor to force them to go through a process by going through one ourselves. So, I think that's really important for us because that's where individual members, majority and minority, have a chance to get their input. You know, they have a chance to raise an argument in committee. They have a chance to get an amendment adopted. As my friend, Mr. Massey, pointed out, he probably holds views on this issue that most of the Judiciary Committee, certainly on my friends on the other side, would not agree with. But they still accepted one of his amendments last week because they thought it was a thoughtful amendment. We are abandoning all chance of doing that by how we're proceeding here. Again, I didn't mean to get on my high horse about process, but I think it's important here, and I think we ought to think about it institutionally because, again, so far, and my friend and I probably agree a lot about the Senate process and the frustrations. Believe me, we've had all the frustrations you have. I could count the number in hundreds of bills that we sent to the Democratic Senate that use these same rules to thwart even a discussion of bills we've done. So we have this in common. But we as an institution maybe sometime ought to sit down and talk because we all find ourselves in this position. Any majority and a minority. And I do think, you know, we are empowering bad behavior on the other side of the rotunda by not following a process ourselves. If we did, at least our members would have an opportunity in committee. Our members would have an opportunity. Right now, this is the only place you can come and put a deal. And you know, no offense, but we know what we're going to do here. This bill is moving out of here. You know, we're going to offer some amendments. I'm really pleased that you both have come here and offered amendments as well. I think that's important, but it doesn't substitute for a real committee and a real process, and then a real conference committee with the other side where we tell them, we are not just going to accept what you decide to do behind closed doors. We are not going to accept it. We are going to go through our process. We are going to present an alternative product. And then let's sit and talk because we're not going to automatically pass anything a group of you decide to get together and do. We've done that now several times this Congress. You know, we did it on a $1.5 trillion bill. $1.5 trillion. We're getting ready to do it now on an issue that our members feel very strongly about on both sides in different ways. But I respect that passion. But my friends in the majority are getting ready to pass what they call a miserable piece of legislation. Well, you know, you don't have to do it. You know, you could produce a better piece of legislation and demand that the other body come to conference with you and say, we're not, you know, taking this. And I just, again, I just think that's something we ought to think about and reflect about because we are going to find ourselves in this position again and again and again if we keep, frankly, rolling over to it, allowed ourselves to be bullied by whoever on the other side happens to get together and call something bipartisan and say, this is the best we can do. You in the House of Representatives have to accept it because our rules won't allow you to do anything else. That's just ridiculous. So anyway, I suspect we share some opinions. We might not agree about the bill, but, and I know my friends are in a hurry, and I respect the reasons why, quite frankly, to get, quote unquote, something done. But we are surrendering an awful lot here to the other side. My friends are accepting less than they want. We are being shut out more than we like. And that's just, I just think collectively as members of the House of Representatives, we ought to not let that happen to us again and again. And it appears to me to be happening a lot. So with that, sorry, Mr. Chairman.
No, I appreciate it, and much of what you've stated, I agree with. But I should also say that when we were in the minority, the process here was used to prevent us from even discussing the issue on the House floor. And I don't like the process in the Senate, but it is what it is. And let's not kid each other. If we decide to add things to the bill or change this bill, it's dead. Senate won't take it up. And so while I would like the Senate to enter into a conference on everything we do here, because I think we produce better legislation than they do, they have a process where a small group of senators can derail everything. And they have done that consistently on every gun safety measure that we have sent over. And I think the question for everybody here is, as imperfect as this bill is, you know, is it a step in the right direction? I personally believe it is. And, you know, and do we want to engage in any kind of maneuvers here that would mean that nothing gets done? And again, as I said, I think people are hoping that we can get something done, no matter how modest it may be, because it's an acknowledgement that we are finally understanding that we have a gun violence epidemic in this country where little kids are being killed, where people in grocery stores and people in churches are being killed, in movie theaters. And people, I don't care, of all political persuasions, are just so frustrated, you know, that for years we've done nothing. So that's where we are. Ms. Torres. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to thank both our witnesses for coming today and presenting us with their very well-constructed amendments to try to help this process and improve this process. I really can't add much to what the ranking member already articulated, but I think at the very least, we should make these amendments in order and allow the members of the House to vote their will on these two amendments that were brought forward. I'll find myself also agreeing with Mr. Massey, because really this is the only hearing we're having on this on the House side. I think we owe the House an open rule on this so that all members can be heard. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I want to, these amendments and some comments by Mr. Reschenthaler, I want to bring up the report that I entered into the record, first-year implementation of the Colorado's Violence Prevention Act. I mean, one of the areas for our red flag law, particularly is in domestic violence situations and in suicide. And I've brought ex parte applications to a court, and you've got to have overwhelming evidence of some immediate emergent situation. And so to those judges, you're giving them a lot of evidence because it's only going to be for a short term until everybody can have a chance to appear before the court, but you're trying to avoid an emergency situation where somebody in those instances is either going to hurt themselves or a close family contact, spouse, whatever it may be. And in Colorado, we've had some instances where the thing was abused, and somebody tried to get guns in an ex parte situation, but the court denied it. Said, no, this is not how it should proceed. So for me, and I hear Mr. Cole, I hear the arguments against today's process, but we've gone decades now without addressing any of this. None of it. Thousands of people have died, and these things will help stem that. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Could we go to conference? Absolutely, we could. And then see what happens, and again, there's more delay than the years that have already passed by. So, again, I'm going to compliment the fact that we have a bipartisan solution coming out of the Senate, which for me is gratifying that they finally have acted on an emergency situation like this. So I've heard Ms. Green, I heard Mr. Massey and their interpretation of the Constitution, which is very different than my interpretation of the Constitution and the fact that the preamble talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody. And we've gotten too many people killed because we've been unwilling to address this. So for me, we've had success with our red flag law. We haven't, our Supreme Court has said it's constitutional, that there is an opportunity for people to respond, that it does address emergency situations. And I just appreciate the Senate, you know, as flawed as the process may be, Mr. Cole, taking this up, for us taking action quickly, because this is going to save lives. And I yield back to the chair.
Mr. Eschenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Perlmutter, I certainly respect your opinion. I'm going to be offering an amendment on the burden of proof in the standard, so I'll save discussion on that. But I can just say from personal experience, it is incredibly difficult as a judge to ascertain the truth in an ex parte hearing. You're only getting one side. I'd say besides pretrial confinement hearings on bail, probably the hardest thing a magisterial district judge does is make a determination in ex parte hearing. But I'm going to leave that discussion for the amendment. I know there's been two articles that have been submitted for the record regarding red flag laws. I just want to say that there was a study conducted by the Crime Prevention Research Center in 2018 that found, and I quote, red flag laws had no significant effect on murder, suicide, the number of people killed in mass public shootings, robbery, aggravated assault, or burglary, end quote. So I'm going to ask unanimous consent to enter that entire study into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, Ms. Green, it seemed like you had something you wanted to add. I'll yield to you.
Yes, thank you. In regards to red flag laws, they just won't stop someone when they want to murder someone. And that's just the reality and the great concern. But what they will do is they'll violate people's due process rights. And I think that we all need to recognize the giant political divide in our country. I think we need to recognize that over the past several years, Americans are looking at one another, and they simply may not like someone's political views. They may not like their Trump flag in their yard. They may not like someone else's statements. And this brings this big slippery slope for false accusations to where they could, claim that someone is at a risk of killing others with their guns simply because they hold such political views or may have voted for a candidate for office. And I think this is putting Americans in danger, especially, gun owners, of losing their gun rights because someone is trying to take their guns away simply because they don't like them and may think a gun owner is dangerous when a gun owner is not dangerous. Taking away Americans' gun rights is dangerous. And I'd also like to discuss the fact that I think we're looking at this through the wrong lens. We all share something that's so important, and I'm really happy to hear you say the things you say. None of us want to see children killed in school. None of us want to see any group of people attacked in a way where they are at risk of losing their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's why I think abortion is wrong. Takes away Americans' ability to ever have life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness. But I think we also need to recognize that the gun being on trial is the wrong direction to go. We have a broken spirit problem in America. We have a broken human problem in America. And there's nothing that we're legislating here. There's nothing in this bill, and like everyone said, we didn't have anything to do with it. The Senate did, and they did it behind closed doors, and the process is all wrong. And thank you, Mr. Cole, for recognizing that. But this isn't solving anything, and I wish it was. Actually, it's causing Americans to distrust Congress even more than they already distrust us. They don't trust Congress because Congress just steadily violates people's rights. And I think that's a shame. So I really ask that you consider my amendment. It's very, very simple. It just states that insert at the appropriate place in the bill in the following: nothing in this act or an amendment made by this act may be construed to deny or infringe upon the due process rights of a person subject to the provisions of this act. It's so simple. And it's so simple that I think that we can all come together on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But one of the things that we heard from the gentlelady from Georgia was that the proper response to children being massacred in school would be more armed guards, and that the way to protect people is to have more armed guards. And several things came to mind. One was that in Buffalo, the shooter, Peyton Gendron, I think his name was confronted by an armed guard who shot him, but he was wearing body armor, and then was able to kill the guard and go on to massacre people in the grocery store. Ms. Green, do you think the Second Amendment protects body armor too, by the way?
Well, Mr. Raskin, here's what I do believe is I wish that people inside that grocery store had been armed, but the strict gun control where they live took that ability away from them.
I'll reclaim my time. So, Mr. Scott, your state has seen some terrible massacres, like at Virginia Tech. We saw the massacre at Uvalde, where there were lots of police officers around with guns, but they weren't able to stop the madman who got inside with an AR-15, the 18-year-old who got inside with an AR-15 and assassinated those children, such that their parents had to offer DNA to make a positive identification. Couldn't even identify them visually. What do you think about this argument that, well, what we need to do, what I understand her to be saying, is that basically everybody should be armed? Is that going to make us safer if we become the only country in the world where our solution to the problem of massacres in public places is to arm everybody?
The evidence I've seen is if you have armed guards in schools, you have no reduction in killings. You do have an increase in school-to-prison pipeline because the police officers there tend to police the children, not protect the children. And so that makes the situation actually worse. I've seen no evidence that school resource officers improve anything as police officers. If you have an additional counselor in the school, psychologist, things like that, that has been shown to reduce the incidence of violence in the school. And so to the extent that the school resource officers providing the counseling and the psychological services, that's a good thing, but unfortunately they tend to do more of the policing and not more of the counseling. But in terms of a protective, most of the school shootings have occurred at schools that have armed guards. They weren't at that end of the school, or I don't know where the SRO was in Uvalde.
Yeah.
So
I want to ask you both about the phrase well-regulated militia that appears in the Second Amendment. In the Heller decision, Justice Scalia said that there is an individual right to carry a gun. The liberals lost that case, arguing that it was only for people who are actively participating in the militia, which we would call the National Guard today. But in order for there to be the availability of self-defense for people and the ability of people to participate in hunting and recreation, which is traditional, people have an individual right. Do you believe, Mr. Scott, that the Second Amendment gives people the right to be in private armed militias against the government, or do you believe that a well-regulated militia means that the government, and specifically Congress in Article 1, Section 8, has the power to regulate the militia?
Well, I think what was thought of back then was something akin to the National Guard. The state has a well-regulated militia, and those words are in the Constitution. It also talks to the people's right, which tends to suggest a collective right, not a person's right to bear arms. I agree with Justice Warren Berger, who said that the idea that this is an individual right has been a fraud upon the people.
Ms. Green, what about you? Do you think the Second Amendment right protects the right of private armed militias to operate outside of state or federal control?
I believe the Second Amendment gives the states the right to have a militia, and it did not expand which way that went, but it gives the state that right. And I think it's extremely important. And I just want to clarify, Mr. Raskins, I never said arm every single person. People have the right to keep and bear arms if they choose. And I also feel that, if my children are in school and a madman with a gun comes to a school to kill people, unfortunately, a psychologist is not going to be able to just talk him out of it. That is not a good way to protect kids. But again, we enjoy...
Do you think the students should be armed?
I think children should be trained with firearms. I definitely do. I think that's very important so that they understand the
So they could repel someone who comes in.
That's not what I said. I said I believe children should be trained with firearms so they understand how to use them and understand the safety. But I think that we should allow states to choose how they protect schools. I believe more in state rights and a lot less in federal intervention.
I want to be clear about your position. There are 50 states that now ban private militias on the theory that people don't have a right to take up arms against the government. You agree with that?
Mr. Raskins, I believe we're talking about due process rights. I'm not sure how we're onto this about private...
We're talking about the Second Amendment.
Yes, we're talking about the Second Amendment. That's right. I think
you mentioned abortion a moment ago, but if we could stick to guns for a second.
Well, abortion kills babies, innocent. We're talking about kids being killed.
Okay, good.
Abortion kills innocent children.
All right, I got your...
They can't protect themselves at all from this horrific procedure.
Sounds like you want to arm them. But in any event, my question is about militias.
That's impossible, Mr. Raskins.
But I wanted to talk about militias. Do you agree that it's constitutional for the 50 states to ban private militias?
I don't think they should be banned. The federal government isn't protecting our border. We're being invaded every single day by an unknown amount of people coming illegally across our border. I think we're in a time where states have the rights to be able to figure out how to protect their citizens.
Right. So here's what the states have figured out, Ms. Green. They've figured out that private groups who are armed should not be taking up arms against the government and have no Second Amendment right against the state. So you agree with that?
I think the Second Amendment is clear. It means that we need well-armed citizens. And I believe that's extremely important, Mr. Raskins. And as weird as this body, or the Senate perhaps, is trying to violate the Second Amendment, but yet the Supreme Court just ruled yesterday that Americans need to be able to keep and bear arms, carry them.
Handguns.
Bear them means carry them.
Okay.
Carry them in order to protect themselves.
But I just found something that said, you're quoted as saying in talking to Real America's Voice that whereas January 6th was just a riot at the Capitol, and if you think what our Declaration of Independence says, it says to overthrow tyrants. So do you think that the assault on the Capitol was a legitimate exercise of popular insurrection?
Oh, Mr. Raskins, I know it's early in the morning, but this is the Rules Committee. This isn't your Trump derangement committee that you call the January 6th committee.
My last name doesn't have an S on it, Ms. Green.
Oh, I apologize,
okay.
Mr. Raskin.
Okay, you've been talking about the Second Amendment. You came here to talk to us about the Second Amendment, right?
I'm here to talk about due process rights and protecting Americans' due process rights.
All right, so I just want to be clear. You've been quoted at least as saying that the January 6th riot at the Capitol was in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, which says you can overthrow tyrants. You've also testified that people have a right to carry guns, presumably wherever they want to go. So it seems to me that lots of people were armed on that day, but the logic of your argument is that everybody could have been armed. and brought their weapons with them. And I'll take that
what
as a
evidence
conclusion.
what evidence do you have that a lot of people were armed that day? Mr. Raskin, do you have that to introduce into the record?
Just wait for it. But when it comes out, presumably you'll be supporting it, right? That they would have a right to have guns and knives with them. Is that right?
Mr. Raskin.
Is that your position?
No, Mr. Raskin.
Well, no, I'm going to ask
I
the
think,
questions here because this is the Rules Committee. You're not a member of the Rules Committee, Ms. Green. Are you? Are you a member of the Rules Committee?
I'm a witness here at the Rules Committee.
Okay, so let me just ask you a question.
That is talking about due process rights, not your lies about January 6th, about President Trump and others.
Okay, I never mentioned him. You've brought him up. All right, I think your position has become clear. You think the Declaration of Independence says overthrow tyrants, that endows the people.
That's
that's
not
a quote from you.
No, you're twisting words in an article.
Tell us what is your position.
I'm used to that.
I just ask that we not talk over each other because our court reporter, the stenographer here is having a difficult time.
Mr. Scott, let me just ask you, and then we can close this, because I think I've gotten everything I need to get, but what's your position on it? Do you think the people have a constitutional right or a right under the Declaration of Independence to attack the government with any kind of weapon?
No, and let me clarify. You asked me my opinion on the Second Amendment. Obviously, my opinion is not consistent with recent Supreme Court decisions. The majority of the court is disagreed, and we got to go with what the Supreme Court. We have to respect the court, and they are working out what the individual right is. And they have said in the Heller decision that there are limitations. Yesterday, they indicated that the limitation that New York had was too much. So we're still trying to figure out what the individual right is. As I indicated, I think a plain reading of the Second Amendment is inconsistent with those decisions, but the decisions are what they are. And, you know, our system is the Supreme Court is the law of the land.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Chairman, the Constitution gives Congress the right to regulate, arm, fund, organize, discipline the militias. 50 states have banned private militias. There is no right for people to take up arms against the government, and I think we need to put down this insurrectionist interpretation of the Second Amendment that's out there. Justice Scalia has made it very clear that the Second Amendment permits reasonable regulations in the interest of public safety and public security, and this legislation advances, however modestly, that goal of making us all safer. And I yield back to you.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I wasn't quite sure which committee we were in for a few minutes there. And I just want to bring it back to we're in the Rules Committee, and we are talking about a very specific bill that was sent over from the Senate, that there was no process that was handled either in the Senate or in the House. And I had mentioned earlier that we do have the opportunity to take it up, send it to committee, and have the kind of hearings so that we are not dealing with these kinds of things in rules as our only stop. And I did want to just take exception earlier on. I think the chair and maybe one of the other members mentioned that people were claiming they were inconvenienced for being here. What we were talking about is the process, and not about being inconvenienced. We came in at 7 o'clock in the morning. Oh well, but I think what we are doing is a huge disservice to the American people by handling it the way we are. And so none of us are inconvenienced to be here to do our jobs. What we are inconvenienced about is the way that we are treating the American people and not having the proper hearings, not following the process. But I do think that we've gone a little far afield, and I wanted to make sure that we brought it back to the fact that we are not giving this bill, the bill we have before us, the kind of process, the kind of hearings that it should have. And I'm disappointed. Once again, I will point out I'm disappointed in that. Thank you.
Thank you, and I just want to remind people we're trying to get this bill to the floor. Ms. Scanlon.
Oh, pardon me, not literally. I don't see anything in the Senate bill that would undermine the primacy of the due process guarantees in the Constitution. So I don't think that the amendment proposed by the gentlewoman from Georgia has any point here, and I can't support it. So I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Desaulniers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Neguse. Don't see him. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate you both being here. You are free to go. Are there any other members who wish to testify, who have testifying on amendments that they want to offer? On the Senate amendments to S 2938, seeing none, that closes the hearing on Senate amendments to S 2938.
I'd like to hear from Mr. Weber just on general business.
On the floor. No.
I'm kidding.
Yeah, I'd agree with unanimous consent to hear from you.
You will hear from me. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Torres.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant a rule providing for the consideration of the Senate amendments to the House Amendment to S 2938, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. The rule makes in order a motion offered by the chair of the Committee on the Judiciary or his designee that the House concur in the Senate amendments. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the motion and the Senate amendments. The rule provides that the Senate amendments and the motions shall be considered as read. The rule provides 1 hour of debate on the motion equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule further provides for the consideration of the Senate amendments to the House Amendment to S 2089, the Keep Kids Fed Act of 2022. The rule makes in order a motion offered by the chair of the Committee on Education and Labor or his designee to that the House concur in the Senate amendment. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the motion in the Senate amendment. The rule provides that the Senate amendment and the motion shall be considered as read. The rule provides 10 minutes of debate on the motion equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and Labor or their designees. The rule provides that upon adoption of this resolution, the House shall be considered to have concurred in the Senate amendment to H.R. 4346 with an amendment consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-53. Finally, the rule provides that House Resolution 1132 is hereby adopted.
Thank you. And before we move to markup, I just ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement from Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee without objection. And also, before we report the rule, I want to take a moment to explain it a little bit. In addition to providing for consideration of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, this rule also provides for consideration of the Keep Kids Fed Act, which the Senate, unfortunately, I'm stunned by this, amended and sent back last night. It also deems as passed a resolution calling for the release of Brittany Griner, who has been wrongfully detained by Russian government since February. It also deems as passed a House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 4346. The House amendment contains a sense of Congress regarding the impacts of the high price of insulin and makes a change to the Internal Revenue Code regarding COVID vaccines. And with that, I yield to Mr. Cole.
I have an amendment before I do a quick comment on these additional items you pointed out are in the rule, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. Some of which I'd like to vote for, but because it's in a rule, I can't. It's just not a good way to do business, and we ought to be putting these things on the floor individually so people can actually do something instead of putting them in a procedural vote where votes are going to follow along party lines, whether or not that reflects the opinions of the individual members or not. That's just the reality of it, and I regret we're doing that. Mr. Chairman, there's a great deal of dissatisfaction with this legislation, no doubt about it. We've heard frustration from every point of view around here. But I think the biggest frustration is we haven't had any process. I mean, this is a take it or leave it measure from the United States Senate that did not even go through their own convoluted process. So for that reason, and, you know, again, I think we ought to give members the opportunity to have some input here, if not in committee and through our normal process, then on the floor. So for that reason, I would propose an open rule. We gave members very little time to come even before us with amendments. You know, obviously, and this is certainly not your fault, Mr. Chairman, we scheduled it about the most inconvenient time, on about the most inconvenient day, in about the most inconvenient way we could. So at least we ought to give members that feel passionately about this the chance to improve this. And frankly, I think institutionally we ought to take the opportunity to tell the Senate they can't do this to us. They're doing it to us over and over and over again. You know, we're enabling that behavior, in my view, by not standing up to it. We didn't stand up to it in the bipartisan, quote-unquote, infrastructure bill. We're not doing it now. I regret that, so I think an open rule at least give our members on both sides of the aisle some opportunity to participate in this discussion. For that, I yield back.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing?
Chairman?
Yeah.
I just once again have to agree with the open rule amendment offered by the ranking member. Mr. Scott brought an issue before us in the form of an amendment that, quite honestly, I had not considered. Now, I don't know that I would agree with where Mr. Scott wants to end up, but I think it's fair that he be heard on that, and I've got to believe that there are other members who would bring other things forward. Mr. Cole is right. The process is so flawed, and this is so important. And we're the people's house. We are supposed to be the people's closest contact with the federal government, and we're being completely shut out of the process. It's not right. An open rule is a way to correct that. I pray that you'll make that in order.
And I would just urge a no vote. An open rule would be tantamount to a filibuster on the House floor if we did that. So you heard the gentleman's amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Any of the chairmen have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Torres? No. Ms. Torres? No. Mr. Promoter?
No.
Mr. Promoter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is no.
Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Members not agree to further amendments.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have amendment to the rule. I move that the committee make and order amendment number 4 to the Senate Amendment S-2938, offered by my good friend Dan User of Pennsylvania. This amendment establishes protection against ex parte gun confiscation. Mr. Chairman, this legislation includes concerning provisions that are an affront to constitutional due process rights. One of the most concerning is ex parte gun confiscation, where a defendant will not be afforded the opportunity to defend themselves against accusations. Once again, we should be focused on passing measures that protect the constitutional rights enshrined by the Second Amendment, not work to erode them by undermining due process. Certainly, whether you agree with the policy or not, there should be an opportunity for ample discussion on the House floor. I urge adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Reschenthaler amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Either chair or the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I'd request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Promoter? No. Mr. Promoter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr.
Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee make an order amendment number 5 to the Senate amendment, Senate amendments to S 2938, offered once again by my good friend Dan Muser of Pennsylvania. This amendment defines an evidentiary standard for extreme risk protection order hearings. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would define the evidentiary standards in which the state justifies deprivation by proof more substantial than a mere preponderance of the evidence. I urge adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
I heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Reschenthaler amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request the yeas and nays.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli.
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross.
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendment. Hearing none, the question is now on the motion of the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres. Aye. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter.
Yes.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Mrs. Scanlon. Aye. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli.
Morelli is aye.
Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross.
Aye.
Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach.
No.
Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and I will carry it for the majority. All right. Without objection, the committee is adjourned. And we'll go into the floor as quickly as possible. 9:15.